Welcome back. We're talking with Robert Scott Bell. He's the host of the Robert Scott Bell Show on naturalnewsradio.com and gcnlive.com. Robert, could you briefly give us an update on the GMO labeling bills in California and Washington?
Well, we've seen two events occur that seem to be the rise of the positive aspects of democracy. We'll put it up to the vote, let the voters decide whether they want to have GMOs labeled and know what's in their food. And in two cases, major cases, California and Washington, both failed, abject failures ultimately, although some would argue, well, look, we improved our percentage points in Washington over California. But that doesn't leave, let's say, much of a real positive outcome, recognizing that if we're talking of a monetary effort, there's no way we can compete on that level. But I would argue also that the PR campaigns for the good guys, those that want to see some level of either labeling or some, let's say, limitation or even reduction or elimination of the genetically modified organisms in the food supply, we have not on this level been successful. So I think a reevaluation of these techniques and a way to go at it more efficiently is in order.
So well, why weren't they successful? You say it's simply the advertising campaign or the promotional campaign for the people pushing for labeling?
Well, some would say that the idea of forced labeling is not within the spirit of liberty. That's one argument. Another argument could be that simply labeling is not an emotional kind of, let's say, tug at your, get off your tushy and do something about it. It's like, labeling, what's that? Versus let's acknowledge and recognize the science that shows the great danger of the GMOs, including cancers, including severe allergies, including gastrointestinal issues. These are some points that were not really hit home. Do you know that these GMOs are causing this in rat studies that are, lasting 2 years? Things that would really be impactful. And I don't think that our side, if we call it the good guys, that are at least a little, if not a lot, concerned about GMOs, have been targeting a successful PR campaign to rise people up out of their seats. So that's one aspect of this that I would like to consider, taking the gloves off instead of being nice about it. Let's just label, we want you to know what's in your food. Well, no, I think we need to go a little bit more direct, a little bit more intense on the messaging.
Robert, you mentioned the liberty debate about labeling, and I know that's a hotly contested topic. In a true free market, the regulation of labeling would not occur. It's up to the business owner. It's up to the corporation to make that decision.
Yes.
How do we remedy that debate?
It's an uncomfortable debate because I'm a liberty guy, and I know you are, and the network is supportive of liberty. At the same time, we've got, if we look at weighing things out and saying, gee, man, these GMOs are really problematic, especially for our kids being born today. How do we stop this? Can we get an outright ban on it? Is labeling the way to go? Is that enough? And I realize most Americans still are very unconscious about food and food issues and the food they put into their mouths. So even having it labeled, as much as the biotech industry and Monsanto has apparently fought against it with a lot of money, at the same time, they're recognizing that eventually they might lose that battle, but they also recognize that many people don't care what's in their food and don't pay attention. I mean, how many people still go through the drive-thru and eat chemically farmed factory food and animals loaded with antibiotic residues? So I don't think they have a lot to concern themselves with, even if they lose the battle on GMO labeling. But from a liberty perspective, I might be arguing to say, hey, what about the companies that are producing food that doesn't have genetically modified organisms, doing private ways to assess and validate that they're GMO free? That would be maybe a stronger argument to liberty to say, look, you can do what you want. But the problem here is that there are issues of drift. And of course, in a liberty society, you can't violate the rights of others. And what we're seeing with the biotech engineering foods, that they are drifting onto the property of others. And rather than being held responsible or accountable for that drift, the Monsantos of the world tend to basically sue with unlimited funds these small family businesses and farmers to claim that they've stolen intellectual property or patented property, rather than saying, oops, I'm sorry, we have violated you by drifting this genetic modification into your farm, onto your food, that kind of thing. So it's a very strange place when
are there any lawsuits in that, to that effect, where a farmer would sue Monsanto because their property or their genetically modified crop pollen has infected their crops?
I'm not aware of any successful campaign in this way. I know it's been discussed. There may be some in the courts that are not being publicized. but we've seen major awards being granted to the Monsantos of the world in attacking these small farmers. But so I don't have a definitive knowledge of cases that have been successful, although I do know that there are some being mounted. But of course, when you have multi-billions of dollars at your disposal versus small family farmers that are doing desperate measures just to raise a few $1,000s at a time, you don't have an ability to take them on head to head. And the court system is clearly biased against the small family farmer at this point and in support of big agribusiness for all the wrong reasons.
Robert, who are some of the companies that do voluntarily label their product as GMO-free?
Well, there are a lot of small family companies and supplement manufacturers, and you can look at the GMO campaigns that Jeffrey Smith has helped on, and there's a GMO shopping guide that lists that. And so there are GMO-free verified. These are privately done. They're not sponsored or supported necessarily by government agencies. So it definitely fits within the liberty context and concept. But as I said, it's just such a strange place to be, knowing that these large companies, multinational companies, are flouting our laws here to violate property rights, to impose their poisons on us, and won't even allow, if you will, for a mandated label, which could be argued is a dicey place to go if you love liberty. So I think we're going to have to be much more innovative, pull the gloves off and target and say, these are what these things are doing. It's not enough to say we need it labeled. We got to stop these guys and gals in these corporations because they're violating our rights to life, liberty, and property.
Now, Robert, we live in America, the land of the free, the home of the brave. Why, though, in Europe are we seeing the successful pushback of GMO meats or GMO crops and corn? Why?
I do have a perspective on that, having visited Europe many times over the years and recognizing the history, the long, rich history, thousands of years of cultures that have not, started anew like we have in America only 200 some odd years ago. And so we have a much longer history in Europe of being farmers, of being closer to the land, of producing the food and eating as it was grown. So when we look at what's happened in America over the span, particularly in the 20th century into where we are today, divorcing from the farming community, the ruralistic, decentralized community where everybody grew something. You knew your farmer, production was local, to this global ability to just, export fiat reserve note dollars, basically built out or printed out of nothing. We know that story. And then allowing this food to be brought in from far reaches of the planet. And so we've removed ourselves so far from the production of genuine food that we've been duped into believing that if it looks like food, it's food, even if the ingredients in there have nothing to do with things that existed for thousands of years prior, including our ancestry, if you have that coming from Europe. So I think because of that connection that hasn't been, let's say, severed in the standpoint of what we saw in America in the last 100+ years, that explains a lot as to how they are much more protective of their agricultural community and their farmers.
Robert, in closing, what is the future of GMO labeling here in the United States?
I don't really know if we're going to be successful at heading them head on, even with these so-called voter initiatives. I think ultimately the breakdown of the Monsantos and the Syngentas, the biotech of the world, is a mass resurgence, a recognition of we need to bring food back into local production. So I think that ultimately the economy, as it tanks further with the QE to infinity, will inevitably make it unaffordable to bring in food from all over the world and the biotech food that exists largely because of corporatism or corporate welfare. That is not sustainable. So ultimately we'll win simply because the law of the economy will not sustain it.
All right, that was Robert Scott Bell. Thanks for joining us on WHDT World News.
Thanks, Gary. Good to be back with you.
All right, stay tuned. We still have the rest of today's headlines and all the news from Hollywood, California, and a full report on the weather. Stay tuned. Don't touch that dial.